Unit 5. In this video, we'll be looking at fungus and plants, how they reproduce, and a few other things concerning their life cycles. It's a good picture just as a kind of an overview of all the different things that we've been talking about and going to talk about. And I think a couple things to point out here. There's some basic terminology, and we've discussed this before, with the difference between haploid and diploid. Haploid, the organism has a single copy of the chromosomes. It would be analogous to having all left shoes, if you want to think of it that way. The full pair is not together, but you still have a copy of that DNA, or that shoe in that case. And so sperm cells, egg cells, as far as animals are concerned, these are haploid. You take one, you combine it with the other, you have a full diploid organism. And so we're going to use haplodiploid quite a bit. We're also going to use the words meiosis and fertilization. Meiosis is the process that makes haploid cells. Typically we call those cells gametes. And fertilization is the process that makes a diploid cell. Typically we call that cell a zygote. Fertilization, combination of the haploid gametes to create the diploid zygote. Meiosis, the diploid cell going through a process to create the haploid gametes. Whether we're talking about fungi or plants or animals, all of those terms are basically going to be the same. So when we talk about fungi, the majority of their life cycle spent in the haploid state as asexual organisms. They have haploid state that is reproducing quickly. They are considered either positive or negative as a haploid organism. Not really male, female, in that they don't have those sorts of characteristics, but they do have a difference between the two types of haploid cells. And the good thing about haploid, again, can quickly reproduce through mitosis to get into the environments that they're trying to get into very quickly. Fungi are decomposers, and so they find a dead thing. They spread out into that dead thing as quickly as possible to get all the resources. And so what do they use sexual reproduction for? Well, sexual reproduction, again, is to create variation. Variation allows for adaptation. Adaptation allows for long-term fitness and survival of the species. And so when the environment is favorable, fungi will go through sexual reproduction. This is how that looks. And so eventually, or initially, what's going on, you have, again, these two haploid cells. Well, they're going to combine, and they create a cell that's got two nuclei in it. This process of these two cells combining is called plasmogamy. It's the fusion of the cytoplasm, literally two cells coming together. And that one cell has two nuclei, as you can see, one positive, one negative, two haploid nuclei. This stage is called the heterokaryotic stage, different heterokaryotic nucleus, so different nuclei. Well, those nuclei will also combine, and this step is called karyogamy. Karyos, nucleus. Ogamy, combination. And so then you have this diploid cell. Because again, fertilization, which is kind of what you could call this combination of these two haploids, has created a diploid. Now, fungi, again, they live their whole life in the haploid state, and so what has to happen for this diploid to go back to the haploid state? Well, you guessed it, meiosis. Now, okay, you may say, well, what's the big deal? Why go through that process? Well, what I am putting here as simple pluses and minuses is actually the process of meiosis, if you can imagine without us going into detail at this point. It's the mixing up of those chromosomes, and so each one of those plus and minus are different than the original parents up here. And so what that allows for variation. Again, adapting to the environment. The most favorable species will continue to live. The least favorable will die off, and then that is the basis of evolutionary change in those organisms. So that was fungi. Moving on to plants. Plants are going to follow this same basic idea. Again, haploid, diploid, meiosis, fertilization, zygotes, gametes, all of these terms we're going to use, except for plants, of course, are going to add a little something to that. With plants, we have a process called the alternation of generations. And a very quick and dirty definition of this is plants alternating between the haploid and the diploid state. Now that doesn't mean that like a tree becomes haploid for part of its life and becomes diploid for part of its life, but the tree itself is producing a haploid structure that then will combine with the other, very similar to gametes, but with plants it's a little bit different because those structures are a little bit more involved. And so, for instance, here's a example of a fern. The fern gametophyte is a little structure that lives on the ground. It almost looks like its own plant. But that gametophyte, find this word, gametophyte, produces gametes, the male and the female gamete. And those gametophytes then combine, or gametophytes produce gametes, those gametes combine, that's called fertilization. You have a diploid zygote still again. That zygote grows up into a stage called the sporophyte. That sporophyte is when you look at a fern, that's actually the sporophyte. And then the whole process goes again. That sporophyte generation produces spores. Does that through the process of meiosis. Those spores grow up to be gametophytes, and the whole thing begins again. Here's the same basic cycle with the pine tree, except in this case, there's a few other things going on, lots of seed and all this stuff you don't have to know about. What I want you to pick out from this picture is what words? Well, you have the sporophyte. This is the mature plant, the thing that you see. And that sporophyte, through the process of meiosis, is going to make some spores. Those spores can grow into the female gametophyte or the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grains. Here, you can see that. Pollen grains are the male gametophyte. And those two things combine. That process is called fertilization. They grow into a mature sporophyte. Same idea. So how can we put all this together? Well, just a simple diagram without a bunch of pictures on it. The sporophyte, this is typically the plant that you see. It's a diploid organism. Through the process of meiosis, it's going to create structures called spores. Depending on the kind of plant, these spores are going to be different things. Those spores are haploid, and they're going to grow into either the male or the female gametophyte. Now again, depending on the type of plant, this gametophyte is going to take different roles. In a pine tree, that male gametophyte is pollen. In moss, that male gametophyte is a little bit different. And so we're not concerned about the ins and outs of which plants have which. I just want you to understand that that gametophyte is going to produce gametes. The male gametophyte, of course, produces sperm. These gametophytes are haploid, so don't forget that. The female produces egg. That sperm and egg are going to combine. That process is called fertilization. Fertilization results in the diploid zygote, and the zygote grows up to the sporophyte. And so you have that alternation between gametophyte and sporophyte, between the haploid and the diploid generation. This is in sexually reproducing plants, which a lot of times people don't want to think of plants as being that, but they do. Now, plants can also reproduce in other ways. Asexually, they can some plants reproduce through fragmentation, where a piece of the original plant breaks off and plants itself in some dirt and grows into a new plant. We can do that on purpose by getting a cutting of a plant. You know, grandma goes to her friend's house and says she wants a piece of that plant, and she takes that piece and puts it in a jar, and the next day it's a not the next day, but you know what I mean. It becomes its own plant because this is a fragment of that plant. This is asexual reproduction. It's not gametes combining new organism. This is just one organism kind of being a clone of another. Another thing that is used oftentimes in gardening and other plant types of applications is the concept of grafting. Grafting is not reproduction in the truest sense of the word. A new organism is not being made, but it is taking a piece of one plant and meshing it in with another plant to create this thing that has two different types of fruit or leaves. You can see that here, taking a piece of one plant, grafting it into another. We use this term, you've heard the term skin graft. Someone who has a burn may need skin grafts where they take skin and they put it on their skin to give them more skin. Well, plants is just grafting, taking a branch off of one tree, putting it on another, taking a grapefruit branch and putting it on an orange tree, for instance. So, and another thing, plants, you can take cells of a plant and you can culture them in a lab to grow new plants. This is a way that plants are oftentimes grown in the lab in order to do tests on them. A cell can be, say, genetically modified, and then that cell can be tested for the different traits that are being used, and this is a quicker way to do that. Just to introduce a concept here, not so much reproduction or anything else, but this concept of apoptosis is one that we will talk about regularly throughout the year. And apoptosis is the concept of programmed cell death, meaning that there can be a particular time in a cell's life when it dies on purpose. One of the things that happens in plants is there are tubes that go up the entire length of a plant, whether it's an oak tree or a dandelion or whatever that is. And these tubes, called xylem, are the tubes that are used to pass water. And so the water will actually travel up these tubes. Well, those tubes used to be cells, and at a certain point in the plant's life, those cells die on purpose, and they're stacked on top of each other, very similar to a straw. And when those cells die, they create this nice hollow tube. And this same concept has applications in other organisms, which we'll talk about when we get to animals.